Did you guys also notice a drop in quality the moment we transferred to this chat?
And the other one?
Alrighty, I think we're live.
I think we're live? Okay.
Okay, hello and welcome to Freeplay's 2018 online sessions. Freeplay is Australia's largest and longest running independent games festival. The festival is currently running all week in Melbourne, Australia. Tickets to the weekend conference are still available and you can find them at freeplay.net.au. If you'd like to join the conversation, our hashtag is Freeplay18. So how about we go around and do a few little introductions about ourselves. Let's start with you, Sherveen, as you're the one that...
All right, yeah. I'll go first. Hi, I am Sherveen Uduwana. I am a game designer, producer. I'm currently working on a puzzle platformer called From Light. I studied games at USC, and that's kind of where I got into dance originally. I started kind of with studio hip hop, and then I really got into the competitive hip hop scene in California, and kind of tried to augment that while I was at school. So I, took some ballet, took some ballroom, and it was like a very big part of my life for like maybe 3 years. And then I kind of moved more into the game space. And yeah, that's my story so far.
Cool. How about, Adriaan, have you gone silent again?
Yeah, so I'm Adriaan de Jongh. I'm a game designer. I'm in Amsterdam. And for the past, well, actually not for the last 3 years, but for the 5 years before that, I've been making very socially awkward games. Some about rubbing each other's fingers, others about dancing and having conversations with other people. And most recently, I made a game called Hidden Folks, which is not at all a socially awkward game, more like a single player experience, kind of like Where's Waldo. But I think I'm mostly in this panel because I made a game called Bounden, which is a mobile ballet dancing game that two people, they both grab one end of the phone and the phone kind of tells them how to dance together. And I collaborate with the Dutch National Ballet on this game. And yeah, other than that, I'm not necessarily a dancer. I really enjoy dancing. I'm just really terrible at it, but I embrace that fact. And yeah, that's sort of like who I am and what I do in this panel.
Great. So Bilqis.
Hi, I'm Bilqis. I'm in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I work mostly in contemporary dance as a producer, not as a dancer or a choreographer, and also somewhat as a critic, as well as an educator in contemporary dance. So I don't really have very much experience with the technological side of gaming, but more from an audience and critical perspective of seeing games in the kind of contemporary dance sphere, the way that they're used either for the dancers to play games with each other, or for the dancers to play games with the audience, or for the creator to somehow create a structure in which the audience is itself playing games. So that's the context that I'm more familiar with.
Cool. And my name's Tim Snowdon. I make games as Milky Milkface and also kind of work a bit with Play Reactive. But I started out in dance. I did ballet and contemporary for, wow, most of my life. It was sort of 15-year period there back in, it feels like another dimension actually, after moving into working with playing games. So yeah, I kind of feel like my perspective is very unified. Like I started making games because I was dissatisfied with how I was working in dance at that time. So I kind of feel like that's sort of the same, yeah, creative space for me. But I'd like to start as moderator. If we could kick off kind of talking to you, Bilqis, about how play and games kind of emerge directly inside dance spaces and what your experience of that has been, or what your perspective is.
Yeah, my perspective at the moment is very colored by what has recently happened in Malaysian politics, and I don't know how many people are really familiar with that. If you aren't, you should be. We recently had a general election where we introduced our first opposition government in 63 years, 61 years of national history. So this was all very exciting, and hopefully got rid of the largest kleptocrat the world has ever known, which is also quite exciting. But I think it's interesting the way it segments kind of with contemporary dance and with games, because Malaysians tend to be a very authority-respecting society, and it's very difficult to kind of push them beyond that. We're sort of like the opposite of Australia, right? Where Australia, it's all about like giving it to man and not participating and being sort of bolshy. Whereas here, it's kind of the opposite. So we've often had contemporary dance be a kind of political site where activism and even like political propaganda can happen in a way that isn't very overt, because we do have quite strict censorship laws, which prevent it from happening in, say, a more articulate verbal theater space, because you can say you can't say that, but you can't say, well, you can't do that with your bodies, when you don't really know what they're doing with their bodies. So a lot of people have used games in dance to try and sort of nudge the audience into thinking about the way we think about authority. So either with having a kind of like reality TV experience. We had a work which was called Becoming King, which was choreographed by Joseph Gonzalez, in which the audience had to vote for the king. And at the end of the evening, a king was crowned. But it was a king of this traditional Malay dance theater form called Mat Yong. And the interesting thing was that the audience, because we're not a particularly traditional community, didn't really know anything about Mat Yong. So we didn't really understand what the criteria was for voting for a king. And so everybody kind of had to work it out for themselves and kind of negotiate their own way through the space, and then sort of come out the end and go, okay, I think I know what makes a king in this context. So also kind of rule making for yourselves, which I thought was a very interesting process. So we've got a couple of things like that, which I'm more familiar with here, which I found to be a really interesting way, not just to break the fourth wall between dancers and audience, but also to get the audience thinking about their particular participation in this context of playing.
Cool, really cool. Just a side note, we're not going to get you in trouble, are we, if we dig too deep into it?
Well, now we have a new government, so it's all so exciting, and they have promised that, you know, all these censorship restrictions are going to be gotten rid of. So let's hope they hold to their word. We'll see. Excellent.
So how about we duck to Sherveen? So just moving from dance into the player side of things, I guess.
Right.
What kind of because you said you'd done a sort of version of some of these subjects before in a talk. So take us through some of that stuff you've been thinking about in terms of how dance has emerged in strange places in games, or I guess even the expected ones that we probably should touch on as well.
Yeah, so I think often when people think of dance in games, I think rhythm games, Dance Dance Revolution, those are like very fresh in people's minds. And I think the main takeaway I want to have from this talk is that there's a lot of like non-obvious areas in games that you can still apply dance to. And for me personally, as a designer, using the lens of dance has been very valuable, and it's been, I think it leads to maybe different solutions than some other mediums. I think games are often compared to film or literature, and I think going in a different route kind of, yeah, helps you with that. I think for me, the things that are really similar with dance and games, I think primarily the fact that it's like a very tactile, kinesthetic medium. I think, you know, with dance, obviously you're moving your body, and with games, maybe that's less obvious because, you know, with a typical controller, you're mostly moving your fingers. But I think it's very important to recognize that that's still a very tactile and kinesthetic experience. And, even in dance, something like finger tutting is still a very complex style of dance that is just relegated to your fingers. And the other idea is that it's invokes like synesthesia. So you are getting an audio or a visual input in games, and that's kind of translated to your input with your own motions, pressing buttons or moving your body with motion sensors, for example. And dance is very similar. People dance almost involuntarily when music happens. So I think those are like the core similarities that I think everything else kind of stems from. I've also always been very interested in embodied learning, and I think that was a big thing that I thought about a lot when I was dancing. The fact that certain movements and certain just gestures can carry certain meanings or charges, and that becomes very true in games, especially over time as more and more games develop and create kind of an established norms for the genre.
So what do you think are some kind of weird examples of games that have a very strong dance sensibility that people might not really expect or associate with games?
Yeah, so I think with a lot of games, with DDR or with Bounden with Adriaan, for example, a lot of the things that get kind of borrowed from dance is the idea of movement, the idea of rhythm, of performing a choreography. And I think a very interesting thing that happens with a lot of those games is they have to invent kind of a shorthand or a notation to help the player understand what's going on very quickly. So with Dance Dance Revolution, those are the arrows that are moving down the screen. And if you've never played the game before, those have no context to you. But once you've played it, they have a meaning, and so it translates to the motions you actually do on the dance pad. I think that's a very common element. There's like millions of dance games out there that try slightly different things. But I think that really, elements of dance can be found in really, I would say all games. But just to name some examples, I think a typical action RPG like God of War, for example, if you're fighting an enemy, there's pattern recognition there. And so a lot of the time you're learning very similar to a choreography that you might pick up. The designer has put in these patterns that you're supposed to learn and execute the same way that a choreographer might create a routine, and then their dancers are expected to learn it. I think some more or less obvious examples. I really find Spy Party, if anyone's ever played that, to be kind of a dancey game for a very different reason. So just to describe very quickly, in Spy Party, you are playing a spy, and there are these AI actors going through a scene, and your job is to move through the scene and complete a certain task. And there's another player who is playing a sniper and is trying to spot you out. And if they can tell that you're not one of the computer-controlled characters, they'll take a shot, and you'll lose. So the part of dance that I think really comes out in that is the idea of maybe like synchronicity or just being part of a group. Often with choruses of dancers, you have to move in a synchronized way, and I think a lot of traditional dance games have to come up with a way of telling whether or not you're dancing well or like performing the task well. And so often they have to abstract it in a certain way because a game system isn't going to know what a good dancer is unless you tell them. But I think there's a very intuitive sense that people can, if someone's dancing badly, it's kind of obvious to people usually when they're seeing it, even if it's not very, like you can't really nail it down. So I think taking that, the judging and criteria aspect of that and putting the burden on a player is a very interesting aspect. And I think Spy Party does that very well. It's a player kind of looking for someone who stands out. And that's something that is often a bad thing in you know, dancing choreo with like a lot of people. That's one. I also think Undertale feels very dancey to me, even though it's not necessarily in time with the music. I think that there is this George Balanchine kind of idea of being able to see the music, hear the dance, right? So the idea is that there's this term called a gezumt. I'm missing the term. It's called a let me see if I wrote it down somewhere. Gesamtkunstwerk. I don't know, but the idea is that I always forget that. The idea is that
First, I think.
Thank you, Gesamtkunstwerk. Yeah, the idea is that every part of the you know, performance is contributing to the whole, and nothing is kind of extraneous. And that if you took one out, nothing would work well. And I think Undertale is a good example of that. I think you could play that game on mute, but why would you want to? Like, even though nothing is really dependent on it, it really makes the experience different, and it almost feels like you're dancing when you're playing that game at certain times. I think also like something like Super Mario, it's the same thing, right? If you were to play Super Mario on mute, you can hear what the sounds are in your head by this point because it's so like iconic. And with games, I think it goes a step further because some of those elements, like the sound of Mario picking up a coin, they can be tied to specific moments and specific actions in a way that a non-interactive piece couldn't really do. So yeah, those are some non-obvious examples. I think I also like to talk about speedrunning a lot when I think of choreography. I think speedrunning is a very interesting idea of someone kind of creating a routine or a performance, often for other people, and trying to execute it perfectly. There is this old blog I used to read called No Wrong Way to Play, and there was a piece about a Megaman X speed run. So someone speed ran Megaman X 1, 2, and 3 at the same time using like all the same inputs. And I thought it was a very interesting way of like taking the same input, the same actions, putting them in a different context and still having them kind of work. And it just reminded me a lot of like, you know, the thing it reminded me of was like, if you guys are you guys familiar with what is it, Chance Dance? Merce Cunningham would do Chance Dance. So he would, Merce Cunningham, for those of you who don't know, is a very big figure in modern dance, and he had the Cunningham Dance Company. And one of the things he would do is he would teach his choreographers, or I think he would teach his dancers, specific kind of moves and actions that weren't part of a whole choreo, but they were little ideas. And on the day of the performance, they would flip coins or they would roll some dice, and that would decide what the choreography was for the night. So they would do that, or sometimes he would just pick the music the night of, and they would perform it without practicing. And so I think those are like interesting ideas in dance that, you know, sometimes I see them in games, sometimes I feel like we don't see them enough in games.
I think it reads really well in games as well, because we already have such a
yeah,
I don't know, like an intrinsic understanding that, well, we'll just let the machine handle this, it's going to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
yeah, I think Cunningham like had this idea that it was the exact opposite from Balanchine, where that music and the dance were completely separate, and they were happening at the same time, but they shouldn't like build on each other, and you should be able to take one out. And so you do a lot of weird things, and that's something that I've always thought would be very interesting, like in games. And I'm not sure if you guys have any examples of something like that. I haven't really found anything that kind of fits that quite yet.
we'll see.
Yeah, those are kind of
maybe that'll happen
kind of the
pretty soon. I think it's a bit hard to talk about dance games without talking about Bounden, so now might be a good time to break into some of Adrian's thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I almost feel like an imposter in this panel where like my knowledge of dance does not go very far. But you know, the reason I got into Bounden was mostly because I was very interested in primarily making a social experience. And so, you know, if you think about dance from that regard, I feel like most dance is very social. And I also, like, when I think about games, I see that a lot of games are not necessarily inherently social. Usually it's more like, even for a lot of multiplayer games, you can still make a pretty good case to say that a lot of multiplayer games are still single player experiences. And I find that to be true for a lot of dancing games as well. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if I know another game that is trying to be as inherently multiplayer as Bounden, as for when it comes to dancing. And so, you know, coming from a more playful attitude, and finding this way to make two people dance, I just felt I had to make that. And that I was also able to tap into the social dynamics of dance. And if you look at Bounden, you know, the thing that it touches in dance is really like, you know, feeling each other, feeling the physicality of each other, trying to synchronize your arms or your movements. And I think there's a lot of depth in there that I feel Bounden has only touched the surface on. So that's one part. And then there's the second thing that I think makes what I find interesting about Bounden is that I don't know how to explain this. Maybe I'll get back to that. I need to think about it a little more.
While we're still in Bounden, I'm super curious to hear a bit about how your relationship with was it the Dutch National Ballet Company? How Bounden actually ended up in that space during development, and what that relationship really did to Bounden as a game.
Right. So it was pretty clear that at some point, after maybe making 4 or 5 prototypes, to figure out a way to make two people standing opposite of each other, to give them instructions to know, for them both to know how they would have to do the movements. It was pretty obvious that once I figured that out, that I would need someone who knew something about movement and who knew something about choreography, because it's some people's jobs. And so me trying to figure out how to do that in like 4 months didn't seem very reasonable. So I thought about that for a little while, and I sat on it and I talked to some people, and then I just decided to just call the Dutch National Ballet to see how they would react. And yeah, I got on the phone with someone and I sat down with someone, and then basically 2 weeks later they agreed they wanted to collaborate with me on this project. And so I primarily worked with Ernst Meisner, who is a choreographer at the Dutch National Ballet. He primarily, I believe, works with the junior company. And so he and I would come together with the junior company, and we would, talk about the game, talk about the possibilities, the mechanics, the things that work, the things that don't work, and try to, slowly build upon and iterate on this dance. And yeah, the first couple dances were very hard. Also, like getting the dancers to understand the limitations of having to work with just rotation. And then the second part was like, how can you make a interesting choreography with what at first seems to be a very limited set of movements that one can do. And so I think it took the choreographer actually, I think 2 or 3 full, it took him, I believe it took him like 2 or 3 full, how do you say, the choreographies, for him to understand like the possibilities and how to play with the music, and that the music comes from the phone, and that music doesn't come, or the dance doesn't come from the toes, but it comes from the hands, which is a very different perspective for a lot of ballet dancers. And so, there were a lot of those kinds of rules that we really had to figure out together. And, one of the most painful moments when I was making Bounden was that I think after having made the first choreography together, I put it together on the phone, and I iterated on it, put the music there, and gave it to the dancers with whom we'd made the dance, and they totally sucked at it. Like, they were so bad at it. It was such a painful moment, right? And so, I mean, I think it makes it very clear that, you know, even though a lot of the choreography in Bounden is inspired by ballet dance, and we try to really incorporate that sort of like atmosphere and that theme into the game, it's still a whole different kind of dance. And I find that fascinating. I think we might have like invented a new dancing genre or something. And so, yeah, it was very interesting to work with the Dutch National Ballet and sort of like do that and go into it. And one thing I maybe want to say on that, one last thing about that, is that Ernst Meisner, who was the choreographer, like his attitude towards this, you know, it was, to be honest, the best collaboration I've ever been into, because the way that he would approach me was, or actually, you know, when I would tell him, hey, you know what, this one movement that you did, it doesn't really work on the phone. Instead of being like, ah, oh, damn, you know, now we have to come up with something else, he would be like, cool, you know, what can we do with this? What else is possible? And like his super positive attitude towards this completely unknown thing, you know, with him from his dance perspective and with me from my game perspective, and bringing those two worlds together, I think was really the thing that that eventually I think made it work very well.
And how do you think the game might have turned out if you had a relationship with a different company, perhaps like not a ballet company or someone?
Yeah, I mean, we can speculate about that, right? I don't know. I think, you know, the elegance of ballet that I wanted to incorporate into the game, I believe that was a good match. I think it would have been a different kind of game when we went to the dance, another dance company, but I honestly, I don't know.
Fair enough. So how about come back to you, Bilqis, because I'd like to know your thoughts on what obligations dance games might have in terms of representing dance in this kind of alternate space.
Yeah, I'm excited about this, Adrian's idea that you could create a new dance form just sort of through the particularities or the limitations that technology offers, that because it's steering the way that your body would work in a certain way, then you would end up with a whole different kind of way of expressing yourself physically, which I think is such an interesting idea. I've always wondered, you know, when you think about dance games and then dance outside games, whether there are those common things that if you're good at this kind of dance, then you're good at this kind of dance. I mean, Adriaan was saying, like, you give it to the ballet dancers and look, they're terrible at it. And then are they more terrible than people who don't do ballet because they have preconceptions about, okay, ballet is supposed to be this, and when we do it like this. But then actually the program wants you to do it very differently. And someone who doesn't have the ballet background may adapt quite quickly to that. But then the ballet person's probably going to be quite resistant, right? Because like decades of information.
I actually found that to be true. So a lot of people, like random people from the streets, would be better at the dances that we made with the ballet than the ballet people. So that's something that we found to be true.
Yeah, that is just so funny to me. But I find that, yeah, things that you think, you know, oh, dancers have kind of spatial awareness or whatever, but then you put them in a game playing situation and it's not necessarily the same kind of intelligences which you think would be transferable, don't always work out. And yeah, maybe it's because dancers are quite pre-programmed in a way.
Those pathways are deep, but they're kind of narrow.
Yeah, really. And it's so hard to reprogram. Like that, the initial source programming is really super strong, and it's hard to override that, right? Yeah.
Can I say something about that? Because this was the other thing I wanted to say about this, is that with Bounden, what I tried to make was another interface, right? A interface through which people could interact, not just with each other, but also with the game itself. And what I strongly believe in is that game mechanics themselves, and I define game mechanics as the physical input that you give towards the game, and then how it's like with an abstract notion, it's being translated into an in-game action. I think there's a lot of games that use very similar game mechanics, and that's especially for dancing games. I think there's a lot more experimentation we can do when it comes to inventing new game mechanics to allow people to give different physical inputs that will, you know, and I think Bounden is actually a pretty good example for that, that will enable different kind of interactions, not just between people, but also between people and devices. That I do believe that can bring in these very beautiful movements and very different ways of interacting between people. So that's definitely like, or when you're talking about like what could bring new kinds of dances or whether there's any restrictions, I think the way that we are able to sense how people are moving and how and the way that we are able to check upon or control or guide people in how to move will ultimately also decide how we can incorporate dance into digital games, right? And then I think there's also a lot of stuff we can say about games that are not digital when it comes how those could relate to dance, but maybe that's not part of this panel.
I think it's interesting also to think about how these kinds of games can help dancers think beyond the capacity that they already have. I'm thinking mostly about training dancers to do very particular dynamics in a very kind of subtle way. I mean, it's often easy to teach dancers to do like the big move and then they can do it, but they can't do the very small, delicate adjustments. And I can remember like working with a German kind of minimalist dance choreographer where the focus is really on tiny details. And he was like, no, your hands are wrong. Like either your hands are too tense or your hands are too, and I just couldn't get it. And eventually he sort of gave up because he was like, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it. But if I had a program that I could work with, that I could just like try 100 times until I got it. And it was looking at those very tiny qualities of where is the impulse coming from and what is the speed exactly. And like, I feel like that kinesthetically would have opened up a whole new kind of part in my brain to think about how to move otherwise and how you could apply then that kind of knowledge and subtlety in other kinds of dance. So that would be cool.
to add on to that, oh, sorry.
I was going to say there's very few dance games, or if any, made for dancers. So I was just going to say, because I know you're quite interested, Sherveen, in what perhaps could be done in this space, and like what things haven't been pulled from dance into games. So I don't know whatever you're about to say, but I'd certainly be interested in hearing some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so I was actually going to say like pretty much the same thing. I thought that would be very interesting. A lot of dance games have like through history been aimed at, you know, taking non-dancers and teaching them to dance through a game essentially, but through approximating dance. And it definitely would be very interesting to see like a more niche game like directed at professional dancers or even like hobbyist dancers, in order to teach them to dance in a slightly different way or with a slightly different texture or energy as like maybe like a choreographic tool. That would definitely be a very interesting idea. So to answer your question, Tim, about what hasn't been seen in with dance and games, right? Okay. So honestly, I think there's a lot. I think primarily a lot of games focus on, I think, the idea of choreography, the idea of pattern recognition, and of executing something, executing it well and being rewarded for that. I think the idea of notation is a very interesting thing. I like how a lot of dance games have to have some kind of like approximate notation. That's something that is kind of a necessity in dance games, but I haven't really seen that kind of taken from dance and put into its own game that doesn't necessarily have to do with dance. For me, the thing I think I'm most interested in is the idea of just context, the different dances having context to it. When I first started learning dance, it was mostly studio hip hop, it was like to call it. So it was very focused on aesthetics, and there was no context. And it wasn't until later that I started kind of getting into that and being like, oh, certain dances meant certain things to certain communities, and they came out of certain traditions. And when they moved to different communities, they would get a different context. They would get a different charge, and that would change the meaning for going forward. And a lot of dance through time is often a dialogue from modern dancers back to people who were dancing a decade ago or something like that. Dance moves resurface and become trendy again. And I think that that's something that I think would be a very valuable thing to apply to games. I think the example I think of is with platformers. The idea of the jump in a platform is a very basic mechanic. You press a button, you jump, you hold it, maybe you'll jump higher. And I think every platformer that has come out since, like Super Mario, for example, has had to address that. The fact that Super Mario already exists, and they're making a platformer in a post Super Mario world. So I think that's very similar to how like dancers and people who like use different movements have to address that. And when they don't, it often misses out on a certain context or something that they could be doing. And I think that that's something that does happen in games, but it's something that I think there's lots of like examples of people who make games without thinking about those kinds of things. For example, control schemes, right? Control schemes are certain, they have certain norms because of what has been done before. And sometimes there might be better control schemes, but also you have to think about the fact that everyone who plays your platformer is going to expect certain buttons to be the jump button. And if you suddenly change that, it is not necessarily bad, but it creates a different energy to it with your platformer, and it's something that you should be aware of. I also think that, the ideas of rhythm usually gets explored a lot in games, but also rhythm goes into pacing. With any game, there's a lot of ideas of how to change pacing to increase tension, and I think dance is a really great medium for exploring how that works. How choreography creates certain moods or certain tones with changes in rhythm or texture, and how the movements change could easily be applied to things like enemy placements in an action RPG or something like that. And I think definitely probably the most important one, now that I think about it, is improvisation. I think improvisation is something that games have, like, there's so much ground to cover with improvisation that has not really been explored. When you're in like a cipher or a dance circle, there's like this kind of energy that comes off, like a call and response. And you're not just dancing in a vacuum, you're kind of feeding off everyone else around you. And that's something that is completely kind of improvised and organic. And that's something that I don't think I've really seen in a game.
I think that's
just the idea.
I find quite strongly in free play, non-structured games. And it's interesting to see how much that's very densely that exists in play, kind of gets a bit lost as we start trying to organize it. And
yes, definitely. I think play is has a lot. It's a much simpler transition to look at play from dance than to look at games. I think once you start adding an object or a goal, and then rules or procedures, it can kind of make it harder to do. But I think that also is an interesting design challenge. Like, can you design it so that you feel that way. You know, you need to design it so that you're feeding off certain energies or certain things that are happening in the game. Or is that impossible? I would like to think it's not impossible, but yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of like overcoming the kind of strict relationships with music that lots of dance games have, where you know, talk about rhythm games, I think they end up being music games more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Adriaan, I think Bounden overcame that quite strongly. But I'd be curious to know where you see your interest lying in dance still, you know, for future games, post Bounden, post, you know, a non-dance game, Hidden Folks, and seeing what's like exciting you still in this space.
Right. Well, I think Sherveen saying something I completely agree with, which is, you know, improv in dance is, I think, a very strong, maybe one of the strongest experiences that I've had when it comes to dancing. And like I said in the beginning, I'm not a dancer. Like, I don't know any like dance moves or when it comes to any form, any genre of dance, but I do dance a lot in clubs with friends, just not in a very structured way or to a particular kind of music. But I have this occasional experience with someone where I can see dance as a language, where me and someone else, we dance together and we find a way to like react to each other. We find a way to really play with each other. And I find that experience is something that I can see working in a game. And I have made prototypes for dancing games in which I am able to make those kinds of interactions happen, make those kinds of experience happen. So I know it's possible. It's just that, you know, it's hard. It's hard to make these kinds of experiences because, again, you need to make your own game mechanics. Again, you need to find ways to track how people, you know, interact with between each other. And so, again, like this becomes, I feel, a very technological question, and I'm almost waiting for the right technology to pop by and to help me make these kinds of experiences, right? Or help other people as well make these kinds of experiences. So my current relationship with dance is that I'm still very interested in the experiences that it brings. It's just, you know, again, very hard to make these kinds of experiences.
So, Bilqis, I know you mentioned kind of dance being able to, I guess, not really hide, but I guess kind of disguise political conversations within itself, just because it does have that kind of abstract layer to it when you put it in a performance space. What kind of you know, political or kind of interventions, I guess, do you see as being important in dance that perhaps we should be, you know, pushing for in dance games? Because I think, you know, till now dance games are pretty apolitical in a sense. So I'd be curious to know what you think, you know, we could or should be doing in that space.
Yeah, I mean, you say apolitical, but maybe they're just political in a very particular way. I mean, they kind of assert a very particular regimen and discipline upon the moving body of the things that you can do and you can't do, the things that the technology will detect and the things that it won't detect, which, you know, as Adriaan says at this point, is still quite a lot. I mean, I think in some ways, like DDR kind of has already created a whole dance form, which is very related to the whole K-pop dance form. It may only be a very Asian thing, but here when you say, oh, you know, to kids, what kind of dance do you do? Oh, we do K-pop dance. And it very much is like a reconstruction of the way that you move in DDR. You stand in one place and you do these very legible movements, which are very forward facing on a very like strict grid of rhythm. And to me, it just looks like, even though they're not playing the game, it looks like they are playing the game. And so, yeah, I think technology obviously has this ability to discipline the body. I mean, everything has the ability to discipline the body, and that in itself is a very particular political, you know, perspective, a kind of a regimen, I guess. I don't know. I think the things I'm thinking about also, yeah, the difficulty of encouraging interaction between people in a game, between people in real life and between people in virtual spaces. It reminds me very much of this dance work I saw recently by a German choreographer named Isabel Schad, and it's a group work in which the dancers have very strict rules. It's a performance, but it can be done by people who don't have that much dance experience. But basically, they have to go from move A through B, C, D, and there's a list of moves that they have to do. But they have to do them as if they are doing them like warm-up exercises. So when you think about, what are you thinking about when you do a warm-up exercise by yourself as opposed to when you're dancing? Like you're really listening to the body. Oh, is that stretched enough on that side? Okay, now it's stretched enough. Now I'm going to move to the other side. So she encourages the dancers to think that way. But also at the same time, the dancers are hyper aware. They're like 16, 24 people on stage. And they're hyper aware of what everyone else is doing and where they are. And so there's this kind of like achievement of critical mass. Oh, okay, half people are doing B now. Okay, I'm going to move to B even though. And it's sort of this strange, organic, collective, they make the collective jump. And that's why it's called collective jumps. And it's that sort of almost indeterminate moment where you can see each dancer both thinking about their own bodies and responding to all of these 23 other bodies on stage, and incorporating those two things. And I think of it very much as like, that's the process of democracy. That is both us asserting our individual will and, considering ourselves within a social space. And is there a way that then technology and games can have a similar effect on the way that we think about ourselves? And maybe it already does happen in some games, that you are balancing that act of having a very individual choice with your own criteria and your own parameters, and then responding to how 20 other people playing the game around you, what they're doing. It might be a similar kind of intelligence.
Yeah, I feel like that's something we have done in dance. We haven't pulled together 20 people. Depending on what we could produce technology-wise, that might be possible.
Yeah.
I suppose, well, where I become interested is when we, don't start trying to capture all that information, and we do kind of keep that human managed, I guess you'd call it. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting and possible to certainly, pull groups of people together and say, let's strip back how we're kind of interfacing between each other, and do it as people together in space, and really self-mediate these kinds of games. Something what I'd like to see.
Yeah, that could be cool. Put 24 bodies. We just see them and see what happens. Yes. And then like improvisation, construct your own through line, construct your own ideas of what are the parameters of your game? What are the boundaries of it? Like having an improv jam, but kind of separately in space. How do you negotiate that? Could be cool.
Very interesting. So I want to talk a bit about, Sherveen, your development practice. And I know you're working on, is it From Light? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And I know that's with a big team, but how has dance impacted the way you approach game development personally?
Yeah, so I think definitely a big part of it is the kind of the behind the scenes kind of working with people. I think when I started dancing a lot more and when I was working on games at the same time, it was interesting to see how a dance team versus a games team can be will run kind of differently or flow kind of differently, and how creatively the exchange is a little different. In terms of the actual design, I think I think sometimes the dancing has influenced the game part, and I think the game design has sometimes crept into how I see dance. a big thing with I think when we would do choreo a lot, we would kind of do the initial choreo, then you would kind of block it out with people, and then you'd start to clean it or fix details or visuals throughout the piece. And that's I find that kind of in my mind it's kind of similar to when you're building out a level in a game, how you kind of start with broad strokes and you kind of just zoom in and kind of fix little things, and eventually you're getting to like really, really minute details. And when it's the bottom of Hell Week before a performance, it's literally just like, oh, your hand is like here, it needs to be like here. And if you're getting to those because you're getting to a point where the performance is good enough that you can start worrying about details like that. And it didn't used to make me feel like I didn't used to feel good about getting to that stage at a game, because it feels like there's a lot of problems when you're fixing really small things. But I think being in dance made me like kind of appreciate like, oh, if we're doing this, that means there's no really huge problems that we really need to fix, and that's a good thing. It's a good problem to have, that you're just fixing these things. Yeah, or it's too late. That's true. That's a good point. Yes, that there has happened where we've just been like, okay, so we have to give up on this one. I think, yeah, that's a good point. I think cutting content is also a very important thing that I've learned from dance that I use in games. Sometimes we've been working on a particular section or a little bit of choreo for a very long time, and I've never regretted simplifying or cutting down a choreo in the last minute, because suddenly everyone gets it and it's like a morale boost and everything goes smoothly. And I think it's a big factor that the audience or whoever's playing your game will, for the most part, not know what it looked like during development, and so they won't see the things that change. They'll really just see the final product, and if the final product is often better than when you can't really tell how what is good, what's going to work, what's not going to work, because you're just so in your head and close to everything. That was a big thing. I also remember learning a big part of choreo is sometimes you want to make things feel a certain way or have a certain energy, or you want, like, say, the certain part to feel powerful. And I think it's a very obvious kind of approach to say, okay, so then I'm going to move powerfully. I'm going to put a lot of strength into all my movements. But if you did that, and practice that every single day and then do the performance, you'll just end up injuring yourself because you're putting in so much energy into your movements. And a thing I learned is that you can make things look a certain way. You can make things look powerful without actually having to put power into it. And often faking it sometimes looks a lot better than really doing it. And that's something I've taken into games a lot. Sometimes I will not go the full route because, putting a Band-Aid fix on something at the right time can work really well and just sell an effect better than if it was actually, working under the hood, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, I feel like dance at least also has that lesson where you know how much something changes when you're about to perform live. Like the act of performing changes a work.
Yes.
Like when you make a game, you kind of, or at least I feel like, well, when someone's actually going to play it, it's going to be so different to what I see and experience here now, that there's just all that stuff that you can't even worry about accounting for, because as soon as it's picked up by someone else, it just is transformed totally into this thing that you, I think, can't fully anticipate.
Yeah, like sometimes we would perform, and one of the things I really like about hip hop is that the audience gets loud. So it's not a very it's something that I don't enjoy about ballet, is that they'll wait until the end of the entire performance to let you know if they enjoyed it. But during hip hop, like every time there's something that someone likes, there'll be like a little. So there's a lot of good feedback. And sometimes it would be just the weirdest things. Sometimes it wouldn't be things that you expect. And it's interesting. It will almost throw you off, like if you're not expecting it sometimes, because you're not expecting to get that energy. And that's definitely something that I've thought about with games is with playtesting, putting it in front of people. And if someone latches onto something that I wasn't expecting them to, I definitely make a note of that and think about it, at least, even if if it's not what I'm going for with the game or the direction, maybe I will cut that, but it's never just like a thoughtless decision. It's always something that you want to be thinking about how people react to what you're making.
Speaking of the quietness of ballet, was that something that surprised you, Adriaan, when you moved into the ballet space? Or was it a bit different to that in your experience?
What was the first part of your question?
Oh, because Sherveen was talking about how quiet ballet dancers can be in response to performance. I don't know what it was like then, practicing or rehearsing with them, if everyone was extremely well behaved or if they had a different approach in that space.
Right. My first encounter with the Dutch National Ballet was when I was allowed to be there during their training. And there was this big Russian, I believe it's either a choreographer or a coach or a trainer, who was constantly yelling to people what to do. And he was also at the same time having a conversation with me, which was a little bit awkward. And the whole conversation was there because just before he started, I was like, so, what's ballet all about? And like, that was really sort of a trigger for him to first of all reiterate to the whole group what ballet was about, but also like tell me all the little small parts that he was coaching for. So actually, no, I've only seen maybe 3 or 4 ballet shows, if you want to call them like that, and I think I've seen dozens and dozens of trainings and working together with the dancers. So it wasn't very loud for me, or it was pretty loud. I think people were constantly talking through everything. So yeah.
Alrighty. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. So unfortunately, I would actually enjoy talking for another 4 hours with you three, but that's the way it is. So I guess we'll just thank Sherveen, Bilqis, and Adriaan, and say that yeah, this has been a really great experience. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, it's a great talk with everyone.
Can I maybe ask what people here are still planning to do with making a game, or maybe how it might relate to dance?
Ooh, that's a biggie.
Well, I mean, just like, in the future, are you gonna make another dance game, or maybe a game related to dance, maybe for everyone? Bilqis?
I guess I mean, I'm not the choreographer, but I do a lot of production and I work a lot with emerging choreographers. And I think this is kind of an interesting direction to encourage emerging choreographers to go in. I think a lot of them have not really thought about it before, the actual going into like working with, people who work with technology and games. A lot of people think about, oh, how do you incorporate technology into the performance space, rather than like, how do you take the dance out of the performance space and put it into other contexts, which I think might be a very cool direction to go in. So yeah, I organize quite large choreo lab spaces with lots of people. So it might be interesting to get one of you to come and talk to them about it, or maybe just virtually.
Cool, very cool. What about you, Sherveen?
I've always, I'm usually working on a small indie game or something in my spare time. I've always wanted to do something with dance. I haven't really put the time into really sitting down and doing it. I think if I was going to do it, the idea I would probably have is something with VR. I consult at Sundance's New Frontier program, so they send in a lot of VR submissions for me to see, and I think that that would be potentially a very interesting avenue to explore dance that I haven't really seen anything in. I mean, I'm sure there are dance like choreography in VR. I've seen that and like things like that, but I think a more interactive piece would definitely be really interesting in terms of like the types of inputs you can do and the types of mechanics you might be able to develop because of that.
Yeah. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, well, I'm currently doing my PhD at RMIT, looking at dancing games and making new dance games. So it's kind of what I'm trying to do right now. And I've got sort of field time with a group of dancers in Melbourne, sort of on and off as part of this process to kind of, reinduct myself back into the dancing, thinking, making process, because I've, become a bit of an outsider now to dance, having, transformed this body into a computer user and not a dancing body. So that's kind of my current process, re-dancifying this.
Very cool.
Cool. Well, I think we're at time.
Yeah.
I tried to wrap us up before, but I guess we're wrapping us up again. So
thanks for the panel, guys. It was good talking to you.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
great.
thanks so much, everyone.
thank you.
All right. See you guys.
Bye.